The richest man in Chicago was seconds away from sealing a billion-dollar deal, until the poorest woman in the room stopped him with a single whisper. Who do you believe, the business partner of 15 years or the cleaning lady risking everything to tell the truth? Alexander Thorne was about to sign the contract that would seal the biggest business merger of his career. Sterling Corporation promised to take his company to a whole new level. Billions were at stake. He was focused, just seconds away from signing the contract, when the door to the room opened. Rosie Jenkins, one of the cleaning staff, walked in with her carton. "Sorry, I'll just empty the trash real quick," she said softly and respectfully. No one seemed to mind. They were all too busy celebrating ahead of time. Rosie Jenkins walked over to the trash can next to Alexander Thorne's chair. She bent down, pretending to adjust the bags. Then she leaned slightly to the side, bringing her face close to his. That's when she whispered in a barely audible voice, "Don't sign. It's a trap." Alexander Thorne froze. His hand stopped just millimeters from the paper. The pen slipped from his fingers and landed softly on the wooden table. "What?" he whispered, stunned. Rosie Jenkins slowly stood up and looked at him seriously, then turned her eyes away as if nothing had happened. She picked up the trash can and started pushing her cart toward the door like it was just part of her routine. But Alexander Thorne couldn't take his eyes off her. Alexander Thorne. Damien Shadow, his longtime business partner and friend, leaned toward him with a strange smile. "Everything all right, Mr. Thorne?" Preston Kingsley asked from across the table. "Are you ready to sign?" Alexander Thorne swallowed hard. The contract was still there, untouched. The folder with the merger details was open in front of everyone. He looked at Damien Shadow's face, then Preston Kingsley, and finally at the door where Rosie Jenkins was just about to leave. The whole world seemed a little off balance. "I need 5 minutes," he said, suddenly standing up abruptly. 5 minutes. Damien Shadow tried to keep his tone light, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Is everything okay? I need to take care of something." Alexander Thorne replied as he walked toward the door. "Mr. Thorne, everyone's here. All the terms have been reviewed. There's nothing left to change." Preston Kingsley protested, starting to sound annoyed. 5 minutes. Alexander Thorne repeated firmly. Without waiting for any more objections, he stepped out the door and pushed it closed behind him. Rosie Jenkins was just a few steps down the hallway, pushing her cart. When she heard his quick footsteps behind her, she stopped. "You, Alexander Thorne," said firmly, pointing at her. "With me now?" She hesitated, surprised, but nodded. They walked in silence to a small break room. Alexander Thorne walked in first, and she followed. He shut the door firmly behind them and looked at her with a controlled intensity. "Explain. Now," he said, arms crossed and eyes locked on hers. "And convince me you're not completely insane for interrupting me like that." Rosie Jenkins stood there holding a trash bag in one hand. "I know how it sounds, but I overheard conversations, things no one else did. They're setting you up." "Who's they, Sterling and your partner?" "Damien Shadow." Her voice shook slightly, but then steadied. "They're using the contract to transfer hidden debts and to stabilize your company. If you sign it, you'll be giving everything away." Alexander Thorne stared at her for a long moment. Part of him wanted to laugh. The other part couldn't ignore the chill that ran down his spine. "What's your name?" "Rosie Jenkins." "How long have you worked here?" "8 months on the night shift." "All right." "Rosie Jenkins." He stepped closer, his gaze firm. "Let me be clear. If this is a lie, a conspiracy theory, or some attempt to get attention, you're fired on the spot." Rosie Jenkins bit her lip but didn't look away. "I understand, and I accept that. But if I stay silent and you lose everything, I'd never forgive myself." Alexander Thorne turned his face and looked at his reflection in the glass wall. Chicago kept spinning below, but his world had just cracked. This woman had nothing to gain and everything to lose, yet she was standing there anyway. "Do you have proof?" he asked without looking at her. "I do. Photos, records, screenshots. I can show you tonight." 700. "Right here in this room," he said, nodding toward the space. "Bring everything. If you don't convince me, it'll be your last day here." Rosie Jenkins just nodded. Alexander Thorne waited for her to leave before pressing his forehead against the cold wall. Outside, the contract was still waiting for his signature. But now, for the first time in his entire career, he was hesitating. Alexander Thorne walked back into the meeting room, his heart pounding. All eyes turned to him as he pushed the door open. Damien Shadow was leaning over the table, speaking quietly with G. Preston Kingsley, but straightened up quickly when he saw him. "Did you take care of what you needed?" Damien Shadow asked, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Yes." Alexander Thorne walked toward the table but didn't sit down. He looked at the contract, then at the faces around him. "Actually, I think I need to review a few clauses again." "Review?" Preston Kingsley frowned. "Mr. Thorne, we spent weeks going over every detail of this document, and that's exactly why I want to take one last look." Alexander Thorne picked up the folder and closed it firmly. "Let's reschedule for tomorrow." The silence in the room was tense. Damien Shadow stood up slowly, his fists pressed against the table. Alexander Thorne. "This doesn't make sense. We're wasting valuable time. Sterling has other interested parties. You know that. Then let them be." Alexander Thorne stared coldly at his childhood friend. "One night won't make a difference. It will." Preston Kingsley slammed his hand on the table. "The market's unstable. The stock is up. It's now or never." Alexander Thorne watched the man's agitated reaction. Rosie Jenkins had been right about something. This pressure wasn't normal. The decision is mine. He took the contract and placed it in his briefcase. "I'll see you tomorrow," without giving them a chance to argue. Alexander Thorne left the room, leaving behind a group of visibly angry men. At exactly 700 hours, Alexander Thorne walked into the break room. Rosie Jenkins was already there, sitting in one of the chairs with a small backpack on her lap. She stood as soon as she saw him. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice steadier than in the morning. "Show me what you've got." Alexander Thorne sat across from her at the small round table. Rosie Jenkins opened her backpack and took out her phone. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through the photos. "It all started 3 weeks ago. I was cleaning Damien Shadow's office when I heard voices in the next room." She paused and took a deep breath. "I recognized his voice and a woman's. They were talking about you." Alexander Thorne leaned forward. Go on. Her name is Vanessa Dagger. Blonde, tall, always wearing expensive clothes. Rosie Jenkins slid her finger on the screen and showed him a blurry photo taken through a crack in the door. This is her. Alexander Thorne felt a chill run down his spine. Vanessa Dagger, his ex-girlfriend, the one who ended things 2 years ago, saying they were too different. How was she involved in this? She and Chuan Damien Shadow. They're together now, and they're planning something against you. Rosie Jenkins swiped to the next photo. Listen to this. She hit play on a recording. The audio wasn't great, but the voices were clear enough. Once he signs, we'll have full control of the assets. Are you sure? Alexander Thorne suspects nothing. Alexander Thorne has always been too naive to notice when he's being betrayed. It was true with me, and it will be true now. What if he finds out? He won't. Trust me. Vanessa Dagger. In 48 hours, we'll own his company. Alexander Thorne ran a hand over his face, the world spinning around him. Damien Shadow's voice was unmistakable, and Vanessa Dagger's laugh, the one that once made him fall in love, now sounded like poison. Is there more? He asked, his voice rough. Rosie Jenkins nodded and flipped through more photos. Documents snapped in a hurry. Contracts with clauses different from the ones Alexander Thorne had seen. Bank transfers to accounts he didn't recognize. They changed the original contract. Rosie Jenkins pointed to one of the images. See this section? In the version you have, it says you'll keep 60% control, but in the real one, the one they'll use when you sign, you're left with only 20%. This is Alexander Thorne took the phone and brought it closer. This is document fraud. It's a crime. And that's not all. Rosie Jenkins moved to the next photo. This $15 million transfer happened last week from Sterling's account to Damien Shadow's personal account. Alexander Thorne stood up and walked to the window. Chicago sparkled below in the darkness, but to him everything felt dim. Why? He murmured more to himself. Damien Shadow's been my best friend for 15 years. We went to college together, built everything from scratch. Sometimes people change when there's a lot of money involved. Rosie Jenkins said, putting the phone away. Or maybe they were always like that, and you just didn't want to see it. Alexander Thorne turned around, still trying to process everything. Why are you telling me this? You could lose your job. Rosie Jenkins hesitated. Because it's the right thing to do. I can't just stay quiet and watch someone get betrayed like that. Alexander Thorne studied her. There was more to it. He could feel it. But Rosie Jenkins clearly wasn't ready to say it. These pieces of evidence. How can I be sure they're real? I understand why you don't trust me. Rosie Jenkins said as she put her phone away. But if you sign tomorrow, you'll lose everything. They've already planned every step. Alexander Thorne stayed silent for a long time. Part of him desperately wanted not to believe it. Damien Shadow was like a brother, but the evidence. I need more proof, he said at last. I need to be absolutely sure. I can get more, but it'll be risky. Then be careful. Alexander Thorne said, looking straight at her. If this is true, if Damien Shadow really is betraying me, He couldn't finish the sentence. Well, find out the truth, Rosie Jenkins said firmly. After she left, Alexander Thorne stayed alone in the room, staring out the window. For the first time in 15 years of friendship, he was doubting Damien's shadow, and that doubt was growing inside him. The next morning, Alexander Thorne arrived at the office earlier than usual, he had spent the whole night thinking about the evidence Rosie Jenkins had shown him. The images of the forged documents wouldn't leave his mind, nor would Damien Shadow's voice in that incriminating recording. He needed more answers. Alexander Thorne went straight to Human Resources. He asked to see Rosie Jenkins' file. Margaret Ellis, the HR employee, looked surprised. The cleaning lady's file. She asked, adjusting her glasses. Did something happen? Just a routine check. Alexander Thorne lied. I need to confirm a few details. Margaret Ellis brought him a thin folder. Alexander Thorne opened it, and his eyes widened when he saw the attached resume. Rosie Jenkins, 28 years old, degree in business administration from Northwestern University, with a specialization in corporate finance. Previous experience in business consulting at McKinsey Company. McKinsey. Alexander Thorne murmured, stunned. Excuse me. Margaret Ellis leaned over to see what he was reading. It's nothing, thank you. Alexander Thorne quickly closed the folder and handed it back. He left HR with his mind racing. Rosie Jenkins had worked at McKinsey, one of the most respected consulting firms in the world. How did someone with that resume end up working as a janitor? During lunch, Alexander Thorne looked for Rosie Jenkins in the halls. He found her on the 12th floor, cleaning the windows in one of the smaller conference rooms. Rosie Jenkins, he said, approaching her. I need to talk to you. She turned around, surprised to see him. Did something happen? Did you find out more about... Damien Shadow. Actually, I found something out about you. Alexander Thorne crossed his arms. Northwestern University, McKinsey & Company, corporate finance. Rosie Jenkins' face went pale. She dropped the cleaning cloth and took a deep breath. You looked into my file. Why didn't you tell me who you really are? Rosie Jenkins looked around to make sure they were alone before answering. Because it doesn't matter, she said bitterly. It doesn't matter how many degrees I have or where I used to work. To everyone here, I'm just the Latina cleaning lady. But Mackenzie, that's impressive. How did I end up here? Rosie Jenkins cut him off. You want the truth? I worked at McKinsey for 2 years. I was good at it, really good. But when it came time for promotions, there was always a reason why I didn't move up. Alexander Thorne listened closely, noticing the pain in her eyes. First they said I needed more experience. Then that my communication style didn't match the company culture. Rosie Jenkins gave a humorless laugh. Translation. I was too competent for my position, but didn't look the part for a leadership role. That's discrimination. You could have filed a lawsuit. With what money? Rosie Jenkins Chanu picked up the water bucket. And who would believe a Latina over a company like McKinsey? Alexander Thorne stayed silent, trying to process the injustice. And your family? You mentioned a sister. Eliza Tate is 22. Rosie Jenkins said softly. She was born with a congenital heart defect. We need $200,000 for surgery. When I was let go from Mackenzie, she paused. Actually, when they asked me to resign, I had to take whatever job I could find. That's why you're here. That's why I'm here. Rosie Jenkins nodded. The health plan covers part of Son Eliza Tate's treatment, and even though the pay is low, it helps with her medication. I can't afford to be unemployed. Alexander Thorne felt a tightness in his chest. Here was a brilliant woman educated at one of the best universities in the country, with experience at a top firm working as a janitor because of prejudice and family needs. Rosie Jenkins. I had no idea. Well, now you do. She went back to cleaning the windows. That's why I recognized the forged documents right away. I spent years analyzing corporate contracts. Those discrepancies stood out to me immediately. And that's why you warned me about the betrayal. Rosie Jenkins stopped cleaning and looked straight at him. Partly yes, but also because she hesitated. Because you're different from the other executives here. I've been watching you for months. You treat everyone with respect, no matter their role. And when I saw they were planning to destroy you the same way they ruined my career, you couldn't stay quiet. Exactly. Alexander Thorne watched her for several long seconds. Rosie Jenkins wasn't just a cleaning lady who had overheard something by chance. She was a highly qualified professional who had recognized a corporate fraud and decided to act even if it meant risking the little she had. Rosie Jenkins. When all this is over. Alexander Thorne. Damien Shadow's voice echoed down the hallway. They both turned to see Damien Shadow, approaching, a curious look on his face. What are you doing here? Damien Shadow asked, glancing from Alexander Thorne to Rosie Jenkins. Just checking on how the cleaning is going. Alexander Thorne replied quickly. You know how particular I am. Damien Shadow looked at Rosie Jenkins, who had gone back to wiping the windows, pretending not to hear their conversation. Since when do you personally care about the cleaning staff? Damien Shadow's tone clearly showed his suspicion. Since I decide to pay more attention to details. Alexander Thorne forced a smile. Speaking of which, did you reschedule the meeting with Sterling for this afternoon? Damien Shadow kept watching. Rosie Jenkins. I hope there won't be any more hesitation. Of course not. Alexander Thorne began walking toward the elevator. Let's grab lunch. I need to go over a few contract adjustments with you. Damien Shadow followed him, but not before casting one last suspicious look towards Rosie Jenkins at the elevator. Damien Shadow pressed the button and turned to Alexander Thorne. You've been acting strange since yesterday, he said, his voice probing. Is there something I should know about them? Alexander Thorne chose his words carefully. Just pre-negotiation nerves. You know how I get before big decisions. Alexander Thorne. We've been friends for 15 years. We built this company together. Damien Shadow placed a hand on his shoulder. If something's bothering you, you can tell me. Alexander Thorne looked into his best friend's eyes, searching for any sign of deception, but Damien Shadow looked genuinely concerned. I'm fine, Carlos. I just want to make sure we're doing the right thing. Of course we are. Damien Shadow smiled. This merger will make us the clear leaders in the market. Trust me. The elevator doors opened and they stepped inside. But as they descended, Alexander Thorne couldn't stop thinking about Rosie Jenkins's words. Sometimes money changes people. And for the first time in 15 years, he was beginning to wonder if he really knew. Damien Shadow. That afternoon, Rosie Jenkins was finishing up cleaning the executive bathroom on the 15th floor when she heard footsteps coming down the hallway. It was nearly 500. Most executives had already gone home. She frowned, curious who might still be around. Through the slightly open door, she recognized Damien Shadow. His deep voice speaking to someone. A woman responded, and Rosie Jenkins felt a chill run through her. It was Vanessa Dagger. Are you sure it's her? Vanessa Dagger asked, her voice sharp with irritation. Absolutely. I looked into it after seeing Alexander Thorne talking to her yesterday. Damien Shadow replied, his voice getting closer. Rosie Jenkins, 28 years old, former Mackenzie, too smart for her own good. Rosie Jenkins held her breath, pressing herself against the bathroom wall. Her heart pounded when she realized they were talking about her. And do you think she heard our conversation last week? Vanessa Dagger sounded worried. I'm sure of it. I checked the security cameras. She was cleaning my office at the exact time we were finalizing the details. Damien Shadow paused. And today, Alexander Thorne was acting completely different. He backed out of signing yesterday, asked a ton of questions about clauses we'd already reviewed. Damn. Vanessa Dagger's voice rose in panic. If Alexander Thorne finds out about us, about the money we transferred, he won't. Not if we act fast. Damien Shadow cut her off. I need to get rid of the cleaning lady before she causes more problems. Rosie Jenkins covered her mouth with both hands, trying to control her breathing. They knew she had discovered their plan. How? Vanessa Dagger asked in the most humiliating way possible. I'll accuse her of stealing right in front of everyone. Damien Shadow's voice was cold. No one will believe a fired janitor over me. And if Alexander Thorne tries to defend her. Alexander Thorne has been my best friend for 15 years. Even if he has doubts, he won't confront me publicly over a cleaning lady. Damien Shadow gave a quiet laugh. He's way too predictable. Rosie Jenkins closed her eyes, feeling tears start to form. She had risked everything to warn Alexander Thorne about the betrayal, and now she was going to be destroyed for it. When Vanessa Dagger asked. Now I'll call her to the main auditorium, announce an urgent safety meeting for all employees. The footsteps faded, and Rosie Jenkins stayed in the restroom a few more minutes, trying to regain her composure. Her hands were trembling as she thought about Eliza Tate, her sick sister, who depended on the health plan from this job. If she was fired for cause, she would lose not only her salary, but also the medical coverage. The building's intercom crackled. All employees must report immediately to the main auditorium for an urgent safety meeting. Repeating, all employees to the main auditorium. Rosie Jenkins took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped out of the restroom. No matter what happened, she wouldn't give Damien Shadow. The satisfaction of seeing her break. The auditorium was packed. Employees from every department whispered to one another, curious about the sudden meeting. Rosie Jenkins entered from the back, keeping her head high, and stood near the back wall. Alexander Thorne sat in the front row alongside other executives. He looked around the auditorium, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. Rosie Jenkins saw confusion in his face, as if he didn't know the reason for the meeting either. Damien Shadow stepped onto the stage carrying a manila folder. His face was serious, almost grim. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice." His voice echoed through the microphone. "Unfortunately, I need to address a very serious issue involving the security of our company." A nervous murmur spread through the room. "Yesterday, we discovered that confidential documents were photographed and removed from the executive offices." Damien Shadow paused for effect. "This is not only a breach of contract, but also a case of corporate espionage." Rosie Jenkins felt a chill run through her. She knew exactly where this was going. "After a detailed investigation with our security team, we've identified the person responsible." Damien Shadow looked directly at Rosie Jenkins. "Rosie Jenkins, from the cleaning staff. Would you please come forward?" All eyes turned to check Rosie Jenkins. She felt hundreds of stares on her, some curious, others already judging. Her legs were shaking, but she walked to the front of the room, keeping her dignity despite the humiliation she knew was coming. "Miss Rosie Jenkins," Damien Shadow continued, his voice taking on a cold, authoritative tone. "Photos of confidential company documents were found on your phone. How do you explain that?" Rosie Jenkins looked at Mosho. Alexander Thorne, sitting in the front row. He seemed shocked, caught between surprise and confusion. She could see the struggle in his eyes. Rosie Jenkins began. Damien Shadow cut her off. "In addition," he said, "security cameras show you entering executive offices outside of your scheduled cleaning hours." He opened the folder and pulled out printed photos. These images were taken last week. The photos were passed along the front row. Rosie Jenkins saw Alexander Thorne take one, and his face twisted into what looked like disappointment. "Miss Ishum, Rosie Jenkins, theft of intellectual property is a federal crime," Damien Shadow said, stepping closer to her on the stage. "However, given your previously clean record, we're offering termination for cause instead of involving law enforcement." "This isn't fair." Rosie Jenkins finally found her voice. "I was trying to protect." "Protect what?" Damien Shadow interrupted harshly. "Your own interests. Were you planning to sell this information to our competitors?" "Oh, I was protecting Mr. Thorne from enough." Damien Shadow slammed his fist on the podium. "I won't allow a dishonest employee to defame this company or its executives." Rosie Jenkins looked at Chom. Alexander Thorne, in desperation, silently pleading for him to say something to defend her, but Alexander Thorne remained silent, his face a mask of inner conflict. "Security, please escort Miss Rosie Jenkins out of the building." Damien Shadow signaled to two uniformed guards. "She is no longer permitted on our premises." Alexander Thorne. Rosie Jenkins cried out as the guards approached. "You know I was trying to help. You saw the evidence." Alexander Thorne stood up slowly, and for a moment. Rosie Jenkins thought he was finally going to speak, that he would stand up against the injustice happening right in front of him. But then he looked away, his jaw tight. "I'm sorry it's come to this. Rosie Jenkins," he said softly, almost in a whisper. "But the evidence is very clear. Rosie Jenkins." His heart shattered. The man she had risked everything for, the one she tried to save from devastating betrayal, was choosing to believe his betrayer. "Alexander Thorne. Please." Her voice broke. "You know who I really am. You know I would never." "That's enough, Miss Rosie Jenkins." Damien Shadow stepped down from the stage and walked toward her, a cruel smile on his face. "The act is over." The security guards grabbed Rosie Jenkins by the arms, but she pulled away with dignity. "I can walk on my own." Her voice was steady again, even though tears were streaming down her face, as she was being escorted out of the auditorium. Rosie Jenkins stopped and turned to Alexander Thorne one last time. "When you find out the truth," she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "remember you had the chance to do the right thing today, and you chose not to." Alexander Thorne closed his eyes as if her words were physical blows. Rosie Jenkins was escorted out of the building under the watchful eyes of hundreds of co-workers. Some looked sorry for her. Others looked relieved that the problem had been taken care of. On the sidewalk, one of the guards handed her a box with her few personal belongings. "I'm sorry, Miss Rosie Jenkins," said the older guard, clearly embarrassed. "Orders are orders." Rosie Jenkins nodded, took the box, and started walking toward the subway station. With each step, she felt the weight of humiliation and betrayal. But even more than that, she felt the heavy burden of knowing that Alexander Thorne was walking straight into a trap, and now she had no way to warn him back in the auditorium. Alexander Thorne remained seated even after all the other employees had left. Damien Shadow came over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know this is hard. Alexander Thorne, she seemed like a good employee," he said, his voice full of fake sympathy. "But sometimes people let us down." Alexander Thorne looked at his friend, searching for any sign of dishonesty. But Damien Shadow looked genuinely concerned. "The evidence was very clear," Alexander Thorne murmured, mostly to himself. "Yes, it was," Damien Shadow agreed. "But now we can focus on what really matters: the merger with Sterling. Our company is about to become an empire. Alexander Thorne. We can't let disloyal employees ruin our dream." Alexander Thorne nodded slowly, but a part of him, a small but persistent part, couldn't forget the honest desperation in Rosie Jenkins' voice when she called his name. "Shall we reschedule the signing for tomorrow morning?" Damien Shadow asked. "First thing, no more delays." "Yes." Alexander Thorne stood up, still trying to process everything. "First thing," as he left the auditorium. Alexander Thorne couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and somewhere in the city. Rosie Jenkins walked the streets of Chicago carrying a box of belongings and a broken heart, still determined to find a way to save the man who hadn't been able to save her. Alexander Thorne couldn't sleep at all that night. The image of Rosie Jenkins being escorted out of the building wouldn't leave his mind. The desperation in her voice, the way she called out his name, begging him to stand up for her, and he had stayed silent. At 3 horas in the morning, he gave up trying to sleep. He got dressed quickly and drove to the office. The building was empty, with only the night guards patrolling the halls. Alexander Thorne used his access card to take the executive elevator. Something about Damien Shadow's accusations didn't make sense. Rosie Jenkins had shown deep knowledge of corporate contracts, had spotted discrepancies that only someone with financial experience would notice. Why would a woman with that kind of expertise try to sell company secrets? And why would she risk everything to warn him about a betrayal if she was involved in corporate espionage? Alexander Thorne reached his office and turned on his computer. He decided to investigate on his own. He started by reviewing the merger files with Sterling Corporation. He opened every document, every spreadsheet, every attached contract. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but Rosie Jenkins had mentioned hidden clauses. If they were real, Alexander Thorne knew they would be hard to find. 3 hours later, he found the first irregularity. In the main contract on page 47, there was a reference to Addendum C that Alexander Thorne had never seen before. According to the document, this addendum included technical specifications and post-merger asset distribution. But when he looked for Addendum C in the digital folder, it wasn't there. Intrigued, Alexander Thorne accessed the company's main server. He used his CEO credentials to browse the most protected files. Finally, in an encrypted folder he had never seen before, he found what he was looking for. Addendum C, Post-Merger Asset Distribution. Alexander Thorne opened the file and felt his blood run cold. According to the document, after the merger, 80% of Miller Technologies' assets would be transferred to a subsidiary called Sterling International Holdings. Alexander Thorne had never heard of this company. He kept reading and found out that Sterling International Holdings was registered in the Cayman Islands and had only 2 main shareholders: Damien Shadow and Vanessa Dagger. This can't be. Alexander Thorne murmured, reading the document 3 more times just to be sure. But it was all there in small print and complex legal terms. The plan was both clever and cruel. Alexander Thorne would sign the contract, thinking he was keeping majority control of the company, when in fact he'd be handing over almost everything to a shell company secretly controlled by his best friend and his ex-girlfriend. Alexander Thorne printed the document and kept digging. Using his CEO credentials, he accessed the company's banking records. What he found confirmed his worst fears. In the last 2 months, several so-called merger preparation transfers had been made totaling $23 million. The money had supposedly gone to Sterling Corporation accounts, but Alexander Thorne noticed something strange. The account numbers didn't match the ones listed in the original contract. Using his access to the corporate banking system, Alexander Thorne traced where the money actually went. $23 million had been transferred to a personal account under the name El Vega. Damien Shadow. 15 years of friendship. Alexander Thorne whispered, feeling like he'd been punched in the gut. But there was more. Alexander Thorne found emails between Damien Shadow and Sterling executives that he had never been copied on. The messages revealed that the merger was really a hostile takeover in disguise. Sterling Corporation wasn't even a real active company. It was just a front for the scam. Damien Shadow, and Vanessa Dagger had set up. In one email dated 3 weeks ago, Damien Shadow wrote, Alexander Thorne is completely naive. 15 years of friendship blinded him to the possibility of betrayal. By the time he realizes what happened, we'll already have full control of the assets and be out of the country. Vanessa Dagger was right. He really is too predictable. Alexander Thorne had to stop reading. His hands were shaking as he held the mouse. His best friend, the man who had been the best man at his wedding, who cried with him when his mother passed away, who stood beside him while they built the company, was planning to destroy him completely. He kept investigating and uncovered even more of the plan. After Alexander Thorne signed the contract. Damien Shadow would announce an emergency restructuring claiming made-up financial issues. Alexander Thorne would be forced to step down as CEO for the good of the company, and Damien Shadow would take full control. Then all the real assets would be transferred to Sterling International Holdings, leaving Alexander Thorne with nothing but debts and legal responsibilities. The plan was so well thought out that Alexander Thorne felt both disgust and a twisted sense of respect. Damien Shadow had spent months, maybe even years, planning every single detail. Alexander Thorne also found recorded phone calls stored by the company's security system. One of them, from 2 weeks ago, was between Damien Shadow and Vanessa Dagger. Damien Shadow, are you sure Alexander Thorne won't suspect anything? Vanessa Dagger. Damien Shadow. I dated him for 2 years. I know every one of his weaknesses. Alexander Thorne always trusts people too much. It's his biggest strength and his biggest flaw. What if he finds out before the signing? He won't. But if he does, we have the forged documents. We can claim he was trying to commit fraud himself with my word against his. You really hate him that much. It's not hate. It's ambition. Alexander Thorne was a good boyfriend, but he was always limited, too small for my dreams. With you, I can have everything I've ever wanted. Alexander Thorne paused the recording, feeling sick. Vanessa Dagger had ended things with him 2 years ago, saying they wanted different things in life. In truth, she'd just been looking for someone more ambitious and more willing to cross lines. By 6:00 in the morning, Alexander Thorne had gathered enough evidence to put Damien Shadow and Vanessa Dagger in prison. But he also realized something painful. Rosie Jenkins had tried to save him, and he had walked away when she needed him most. He remembered her words from the day before. When you find out the truth, remember you had a chance to do the right thing today, and you chose not to. She was right. Completely right. And now Alexander Thorne had to find a way to fix the terrible mistake he had made. But first, he had to make sure Damien Shadow and Vanessa Dagger didn't find out that he knew the truth. The signing meeting was set for 9:00 a.m., just 3 hours away. Alexander Thorne copied all the files onto a flash drive and emailed them to himself from 3 different accounts. Then he cleared his browser history and shut down the computer. As he was leaving the office, his phone rang. It was Jamie. Damien Shadow. Alexander Thorne. I'm glad you picked up. Damien Shadow, said his voice sounding falsely concerned. I couldn't sleep after what happened yesterday with the cleaning lady. I know it shook you up. I'm okay, Alexander Thorne replied, trying to keep his voice steady. It was tough, but you were right. The evidence was clear. I'm glad you understand. Alexander Thorne could hear the relief in Chick Damien Shadow's voice. Are you ready for today's meeting? Our big moment has finally arrived. Of course. Bontchan Ajuru. Right, that's right. Alexander Thorne. I want you to know that no matter what happens in business, our friendship will always mean the most to me. Alexander Thorne closed his eyes, feeling the sting of that hypocritical statement. To me, too. Damien Shadow. To me, too. When he hung up, Alexander Thorne knew exactly what he had to do, not just to save his company, but to make things right for the brave woman who had risked everything to warn him about the betrayal. Rosie Jenkins had tried to save him. Now it was his turn to save her. But first, he had to find her. And after humiliating her in front of everyone the day before, Alexander Thorne wasn't sure she'd be willing to speak to him again. Looking out the window of his office, watching Chicago wake up under the morning sun, Alexander Thorne prepared for the most important fight of his life. A fight not just for his company, but for his own soul. Because he had learned a painful lesson. Sometimes the most important people in our lives are the ones brave enough to tell us the truth we don't want to hear. And Rosie Jenkins had done exactly that. Now it was time to honor her courage with his own. Alexander Thorne canneled the meeting with Sterling Corporation, claiming a family emergency. Damien Shadow was furious, but Alexander Thorne didn't care. He had more important things to take care of. Using HR records. Alexander Thorne found Rosie Jenkins' address, apartment 2B in the Pilsen neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. It was one of the city's poorer areas, mostly Latino, where many immigrant families worked hard to get by with low-paying jobs. Alexander Thorne had never set foot in Pilsen before. As he drove down the narrow streets, he couldn't help but notice how different it was from the world he knew. Old brick buildings with rusty fire escapes, small shops with signs in Spanish, children playing on cracked sidewalks. It was a world far removed from the shiny skyscrapers of the financial district. He parked his BMW in front of a 3-story building that had clearly seen better days. The paint was peeling, and some windows had cracks covered with tape. Alexander Thorne climbed the creaky stairs to the second floor. He stopped in front of door 2B and took a deep breath before knocking. Shuffling footsteps approached. The door opened just a crack held by a safety chain. Through the opening, Alexander Thorne saw part of Rosie Jenkins' face. Her eyes were swollen like she'd been crying all night. What do you want? She asked, her voice cold as ice. Rosie Jenkins. I need to talk to you. I found out the truth about Damien Shadow and Vanessa Dagger. Oh, you just found out? Rosie Jenkins gave a bitter laugh. How convenient after you humiliated me in front of 200 people. Please just let me explain. There's nothing to explain. Rosie Jenkins started to close the door, but Alexander Thorne placed his hand against it. Rosie Jenkins, you were right about everything. I found the proof, the contract, the bank transfers, the shell company, everything. Rosie Jenkins paused, but didn't open the door further. And what do you want me to do with that now? You already fired me. You ruined my name. I have nothing left to lose or to gain. Yes, you do. I can clear your name. I can. Rosie Jenkins. Who is it? A weak voice called from inside the apartment. Rosie Jenkins sighed and looked at Alexander Thorne through the crack. It's my sister. She's not well. Please, Alexander Thorne said. 5 minutes. I just want to apologize properly. Rosie Jenkins' Ostas was silent for a long moment, clearly torn. Finally, she removed the chain and opened the door. The apartment was small and modest, but spotlessly clean and neatly arranged. The furniture was old but well cared for. Family photos on the wall showed Rosie Jenkins and a younger woman smiling during happier times. Eliza Tate. Rosie Jenkins called. We have a visitor. A young woman around 22 came into the room. She was clearly Rosie Jenkins' sister. Same brown eyes, same delicate features, but she looked very ill. Her skin was pale, and she moved slowly, as if every step took effort. Hi, Eliza Tate said with a faint smile. You must be Count Rosie Jenkins' boss. Alexander Thorne felt a tightness in his chest. Rosie Jenkins had lost her job, but hadn't told her sister yet. Former boss. Rosie Jenkins corrected quickly. Alexander Thorne. This is my sister. Eliza Tate. Eliza Tate. This is Alexander Thorne. Eliza Tate extended a frail hand, and Alexander Thorne shook it gently. Rosie Jenkins talks a lot about you, Eliza Tate said. She says you're not like other bosses, more human. Alexander Thorne looked at Rosie Jenkins, who turned her eyes away, clearly embarrassed. Eliza Tate. Why don't you go back to your room and rest? Rosie Jenkins suggested. The doctor said, you need to save your strength. All right. Eliza Tate headed slowly toward the hallway, but stopped. It was nice meeting you, Mr. Thorne. Please take care of my sister. She's the bravest person I know. After Tum. Eliza Tate left the room. Alexander Thorne turned to Salto. Rosie Jenkins. Why didn't you tell me how serious her condition is? I told you she needed surgery. Rosie Jenkins sat on the worn-out couch. I didn't think I needed to go into detail. What kind of surgery? Rosie Jenkins hesitated before answering. A heart valve transplant. Eliza Tate was born with a congenital defect. Her current valve is failing. Without the surgery, her voice broke. Doctors say she might have 6 months. Alexander Thorne felt like he'd been punched. Rosie Jenkins, who had been dealing with all this on her own, working as a janitor to keep her sister's health insurance, and he had fired her right when she needed it most. How much does the surgery cost? $200,000. Rosie Jenkins wiped her eyes. The company's health plan covered 60%. I was saving for the rest, doing extra work on the weekends. Rosie Jenkins. Can pay. No. She stood up abruptly. I don't want your pity or your charity. It's not pity, it's responsibility. Alexander Thorne stood up too. I made a terrible mistake yesterday. I treated you unfairly. You didn't treat me unfairly. Rosie Jenkins' boss's voice was filled with pain. You betrayed me. You knew who I was. You knew I was trying to help you, and you still said nothing. While Tiwon, Damien Shadow, humiliated me, I was confused, torn between your best friend and a janitor. Rosie Jenkins cut him off, and you chose your best friend, even knowing he was lying. Alexander Thorne ran his hands through his hair, frustrated. You're right. Completely right. I was cowardly and selfish, but now I know the truth and I want to make things right. Some things can't be made right. Alexander Thorne. Rosie Jenkins walked over to the window, looking out at the street. I lost my job, my reputation, and more importantly, I lost Eliza Tate's health coverage, all because I tried to do the right thing. Let me help, please, Schwa. Rosie Jenkins turned to face him. Because you feel guilty, because you want to ease your conscience, because you're the bravest person I've ever met. His words came out with a sincerity that even surprised Alexander Thorne. You risked everything to save me from betrayal, and I abandoned you when you needed me most. Rosie Jenkins studied him for a long moment. Eliza Tate needs the surgery in 2 weeks. Without the insurance, I'll have to pay for it myself. I don't have the money. I'll pay today. And in return, nothing. Alexander Thorne shook his head. Absolutely nothing. It's the least I can do. Rosie Jenkins gave a humorless laugh. The least you can do is leave my house and my life. I don't trust you anymore, Alexander Thorne. You had the chance to show who you really are, and you did. Rosie Jenkins, please leave. She walked to the door and opened it. Eliza Tate needs rest, and I need to look for another job. Alexander Thorne hesitated at the door. This isn't over. I'm going to expose Damien Shadow and Chon Vanessa Dagger. I'll clear your name. Do whatever you want, Rosie Jenkins said, without looking him in the eye. But do it without me. Alexander Thorne walked out of the apartment with a heavy heart. As he went down the stairs, he heard the door close behind him and the lock turn. Outside, sitting in his BMW, Alexander Thorne looked at the modest building where Rosie Jenkins and Eliza Tate were struggling to survive. He had uncovered Damien Shadow's betrayal, but had lost something much more valuable: the trust of the only person who had tried to save him. Now he had to find a way to earn that trust back, because he was starting to realize that Rosie Jenkins wasn't just the key to exposing the betrayal. She was becoming the most important person in his life over the next 3 days. Alexander Thorne couldn't stop thinking about Rosie Jenkins and Eliza Tate. He had postponed the merger with Sterling Corporation, indefinitely citing the need for more legal reviews. Damien Shadow was becoming more and more nervous and pushy, but Alexander Thorne managed to buy time. Meanwhile, he quietly looked for ways to help the Santos sisters without Tautum. Rosie Jenkins finding out. He couldn't just show up at their door with a check. Rosie Jenkins had made it clear she wouldn't accept direct help from him. On Wednesday morning, Alexander Thorne had an idea. He called Northwestern Memorial Hospital, where Eliza Tate was being treated, and managed to speak with Laura Foster, the cardiologist in charge of the case. Laura Foster, my name is Alexander Thorne. I'd like to discuss from Eliza Tate, Santos case. I'm sorry, sir, but I can't share patient information with unauthorized individuals. I completely understand. Alexander Thorne chose his words carefully. I'm not asking for medical details. I'm interested in making an anonymous donation to cover the cost of her surgery. There was a pause on the other end. An anonymous donation. Exactly. $200,000. I'd like the family to believe it came from a medical scholarship or social support program, something that wouldn't raise suspicion. Mr. Thorne, that's extremely generous. May I ask what your relationship is to the patient? Let's just say I owe the Santos family a great deal. Alexander Thorne paused. Is it possible to arrange this without revealing my name? Yes, we have an anonymous donor program for cases like this. I can schedule the surgery for next week if the funds are in place. They will be. I'll transfer the money today. On Thursday afternoon, Rosie Jenkins got a phone call that changed everything. Miss Rosie Jenkins. Laura Foster's voice sounded cheerful. I have wonderful news about Eliza Tate. Rosie Jenkins felt her heart race. Is she okay? She's stable, but this is something else. We've been approved for a federal medical aid program for severe heart cases. Roria's surgery will be fully covered. Rosie Jenkins almost dropped the phone. What do you mean? We never applied for any program. Sometimes hospitals apply automatically for eligible patients. What matters is we can schedule the surgery for next Tuesday. When she hung up, Rosie Jenkins was crying with relief. She ran to Eliza Tate's room where her sister was resting. Eliza Tate. Rosie Jenkins gently shook her. We did it. The surgery will be completely covered. Eliza Tate slowly opened her eyes, still drowsy from the medication. What do you mean, a government program? They're paying for everything. Rosie Jenkins hugged her sister carefully. You're going to be okay. Eliza Tate, you're going to be completely okay. Alexander Thorne found out his donation had gone through. When Laura Foster called to confirm the surgery was scheduled, he felt a kind of satisfaction he hadn't felt in years. The feeling of doing something truly good without expecting anything in return. But there was still the matter of regaining Rosie Jenkins' trust, and for that he needed a different kind of plan. On Friday night, Alexander Thorne was walking through Millennium Park when he had an idea. Rosie Jenkins had mentioned that she worked extra jobs on weekends to save money. Maybe she was still doing that even after losing her job at Miller Technologies. Alexander Thorne spent all of Saturday looking for her. He visited cafes, restaurants, and offices that hired weekend cleaning staff. Finally, at 500 in the afternoon, he found her. Rosie Jenkins was cleaning the windows of a small accounting office on North Michigan Avenue. She wore simple clothes and had her hair tied back in a ponytail. Even while doing manual labor, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that Alexander Thorne found inspiring. He waited across the street until she finished and came out of the building. Rosie Jenkins. He approached carefully. She turned surprised and clearly annoyed. Are you following me now? I mean, yes, but not the way you think. Alexander Thorne stumbled over his words. I heard about Eliza Tate surgery, that it was approved by a government program. Rosie Jenkins looked at him with suspicion. So what, I'm happy for you. Truly happy. Thank you. She started walking toward the subway station. Alexander Thorne walked alongside her. Rosie Jenkins Can I talk to you? Just 5 minutes about what? About how awful I feel about what happened. About how you were right about everything. About how I want to make things right this time. Rosie Jenkins stopped and looked at him. Alexander Thorne, I understand you feel guilty, but like I said before, I don't need your pity. It's not pity. Alexander Thorne took a deep breath. It's admiration, respect, and something more I'm still trying to figure out. Rosie Jenkins frowned. Something more, you made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. Alexander Thorne stepped a little closer. About loyalty, about courage, about doing the right thing, even when it's hard. Alexander Thorne, please let me finish. He went on, you risked everything to save me from betrayal. And when it was my turn to stand up for you, I failed. But that taught me something important about who I really am and who I want to become. Rosie Jenkins looked at him in silence for a long moment. And who do you want to become? Someone worthy of the courage you showed, someone who doesn't let fear or blind loyalty get in the way of doing what's right. The cold Chicago wind blew between them and Rosie Jenkins pulled her coat tighter around her. It's chilly out here, she said, glancing around. There's a coffee shop on the corner. We can talk there. The small cafe was nearly empty. They sat at a table by the window, 2 steaming cups of hot chocolate between them. So, Rosie Jenkins said, stirring her drink with a small spoon. What did you find out about Damien Shadow and Vanessa Dagger? Alexander Thorne pulled a folder from his backpack and laid it on the table. Everything. The entire plan. He opened the folder and showed her the documents. The shell company, the wire transfers, the fake contract. They were planning to steal 80% of my assets. Rosie Jenkins flipped through the papers, and Alexander Thorne saw her eyes widen as she read. This is worse than I imagined. She looked up at him. What are you going to do? Expose them publicly on Monday? Alexander Thorne leaned in closer. But I need your help. My help. You still have the original photos, the recordings. I need your evidence to complete the case. Rosie Jenkins fell silent, thinking it over. And then after, Damien Shadow and Vanessa Dagger are exposed. Then Alexander Thorne hesitated. Then I'd like you to come back to the company not as a cleaner, as vice president of operations. Rosie Jenkins nearly choked on her hot chocolate. Vice president. You have the knowledge, the experience, and the integrity. The company needs people like you and leadership. Alexander Thorne. This is... Rosie Jenkins shook her head. It's crazy. You're not just anything. Alexander Thorne interrupted. You're smart, brave, and honest. Those are exactly the qualities I need by my side. They sat quietly for a few minutes, the weight of the conversation settle in between them. Can I think about it? Rosie Jenkins asked finally. Of course, but... Rosie Jenkins. Alexander Thorne reached across the table, his hand almost touching hers. No matter what you decide about the job, I'd like to have you in my life in some way. Rosie Jenkins looked at his hand, then at his eyes. Alexander Thorne. We come from very different worlds. No, he said, shaking his head. I used to think that, but I don't anymore. We're just 2 people who believe in doing what's right, even when it's hard. When they left the cafe, night had fallen. The lights of Chicago sparkled around them, creating an almost magical atmosphere. They walked slowly toward the subway station, neither in a hurry to end the night. Alexander Thorne, Rosie Jenkins, said as they reached the entrance to the station. Thank you for today, for listening, for being different than I thought you were. And thank you for giving me a second chance. I know I didn't deserve it. They stood under the streetlights, looking at each other. Rosie Jenkins looked beautiful, her cheeks pink from the cold, her eyes shining under the stars. Rosie Jenkins. Alexander Thorne stepped closer. Yes. Can I kiss you? Rosie Jenkins hesitated only for a second, then nodded. Alexander Thorne kissed her gently at first, then more confidently as she responded. It was a sweet kiss full of promises and new beginnings. When they pulled apart, they were both smiling. This just made things more complicated, Rosie Jenkins said. But her smile showed she didn't mind. The best things in life usually do, Alexander Thorne replied. Rosie Jenkins laughed and walked toward the subway entrance. I'll call you tomorrow, she said, to go over the plan for Monday. And want to talk about us. And to talk about us, she confirmed, before disappearing down the stairs. Alexander Thorne stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, gazing at the stars above Chicago. For the first time in weeks, he felt like everything was going to be okay. On Monday, he would face Damien Shadow and Vanessa Dagger. But this time, he wouldn't be alone. He would have Rosie Jenkins by his side. And that made all the difference. On Monday morning, Alexander Thorne arrived at the office determined to carry out his plan. He had spent all of Sunday with Rosie Jenkins, planning every detail of how to expose Damien Shadow and Vanessa Dagger. They had scheduled a board meeting for 2 where they would present all the evidence of the betrayal. Alexander Thorne stored the incriminating documents in his personal safe and prepared copies to hand out during the meeting. He was nervous but confident. Rosie Jenkins would arrive at noon to go over the final details. At 10 home, Damien Shadow walked into his office without knocking. Alexander Thorne, we need to talk. His voice had a tone Alexander Thorne had never heard before, cold, threatening. Sure, Alexander Thorne said, trying to stay calm. About what? Damien Shadow closed the door behind him and stepped closer to Alexander Thorne's desk. About your little late-night investigation on Friday. Alexander Thorne's blood ran cold. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me. Alexander Thorne. Damien Shadow sat down in the chair across from the desk, crossing his legs with arrogance. Do you think I'm stupid that I wouldn't notice someone accessing confidential files in the middle of the night? Alexander Thorne kept a neutral expression, but inside he was panicking. I have the right to access any file in my own company. Oh yes, your company. Damien Shadow gave a humorless laugh. For now, what's that supposed to mean? Damien Shadow pulled his phone from his pocket and placed it on the table. It means I know exactly what you found. I know you talked to the cleaning lady. I know you're planning to expose me this afternoon. Alexander Thorne stood up suddenly. How do I know? Damien Shadow interrupted. Alexander Thorne, you're even more naive than I thought. You think I don't have people keeping me informed about your every move. The office door opened again, and Vanessa Dagger walked in. She looked perfect as always, but there was something cold and cruel in her eyes that Alexander Thorne had never seen before. "Hello, Alexander Thorne." She walked over and kissed Damien Shadow on the cheek. "I missed you over the weekend." Vanessa Dagger. Alexander Thorne looked at her confused. "What are you doing here? I'm here to witness your surrender." She sat on the armrest of Tamum. Damien Shadow saw chair, running her fingers through his hair possessively, surrender. Damien Shadow smiled and unlocked his phone. "Alexander Thorne, you're going to cancel that ridiculous board meeting. You're going to destroy all the evidence you've gathered, and you're going to sign the Sterling Corporation contract today. Are you out of your mind? After what I found out about you two, no." Damien Shadow said, turning the phone toward Alexander Thorne. "After what I found out about you on the screen." Alexander Thorne saw pictures of himself entering Rosie Jenkins's building in Pilsen, talking to her at the cafe, kissing her on the street. "So what?" Alexander Thorne frowned. "There's nothing wrong with, oh, isn't there?" Vanessa Dagger leaned forward. "Alexander Thorne, you used inside company information to locate a former employee. Then you used company funds to pay for her sister's surgery." Alexander Thorne felt the ground shift under him. "How do you know about the anonymous $200, $1,000 donation?" Damien Shadow laughed. "Alexander Thorne, did you really think you could move that kind of money without me knowing? That doesn't prove anything illegal. It proves abuse of power." Vanessa Dagger pulled a folder from her purse. "It proves you were romantically involved with an employee who had access to sensitive information. It proves you paid a large amount of money to influence a witness." Alexander Thorne grabbed the documents and flipped through them. They were forged contracts, fake emails, altered bank records, everything designed to make it look like he had used the company to benefit. Rosie Jenkins, in exchange for favors. "This is all fake." "Of course it is." Damien Shadow said, standing up. "But who's going to believe you? A CEO who got involved with a cleaning lady and used company money to impress her. You can't do this." "We can, and we will." Vanessa Dagger said, stepping closer to Alexander Thorne. "Unless you cooperate." Alexander Thorne looked at Champun, Damien Shadow, and Vanessa Dagger. Two people he had once loved and trusted completely, and now he saw that he had never really known them. "What do you want? I already told you." Damien Shadow said, sitting back down. "Cancel the meeting. Destroy the evidence. Sign the contract. And if I don't..." Damien Shadow tapped his phone again and showed Alexander Thorne another photo. It was Rosie Jenkins and Eliza Tate leaving the hospital after an appointment. Then Miss Rosie Jenkins and her sick sister will find out what happens to people who stick their noses where they don't belong. Alexander Thorne felt pure rage run through him. "Don't you dare threaten them." "It's not a threat, Alexander Thorne. It's a promise," Damien Shadow said, putting his phone away. "I have contacts all over Chicago. One phone call for me and Rosie Jenkins. Santos won't find work anywhere. And her little sister. Well, accidents happen, especially with people in poor health. You're a monster. I'm a businessman. Damien Shadow said, adjusting his tie. And you, my old friend, are a problem that needs to be dealt with. Alexander Thorne looked at Vanessa Dagger, searching for some trace of the woman he had fallen in love with years ago. Vanessa Dagger, do you really agree with this threatening innocent people? Vanessa Dagger laughed a cold, calculated sound. Alexander Thorne, you were always so romantic, so idealistic. She stepped closer to him. Do you really think I broke up with you because we weren't compatible, didn't you? I broke up with you because you were poor. Her words hit like a slap. Well, not poor exactly, but limited. You were building a small company, dreaming small. Damien Shadow offered me the chance to be truly wealthy. Alexander Thorne stared at her stunned. You never loved me. I loved your ambitions. I loved the potential of what you could become. Vanessa Dagger said, touching his face with fake tenderness. But when I saw that Damien Shadow was willing to do whatever it took to succeed while you clung to your moral principles, well, the choice was obvious. Moral principles. Alexander Thorne pulled her hand away. You say that like it's a bad thing. In the business world, it is. Damien Shadow said as he stepped closer. Alexander Thorne, you built a $500 million company while limiting yourself with ethics and morals. Just imagine what you could have achieved if you'd been a little more flexible. I don't want to achieve anything that way. And that's why you'll lose everything. Vanessa Dagger said, moving to stand next to Damien Shadow. Because in the end, people like you always lose to people like us. Alexander Thorne looked at the two of them, holding hands, smiling with cruelty. 15 years of friendship with Damien Shadow. 2 years in a relationship with Vanessa Dagger. All built on lies. You have 1 hour to decide. Damien Shadow said, checking his expensive wristwatch. Noon, either you sign the contract or we destroy you and everything you care about. And Rosie Jenkins. Alexander Thorne asked, if I cooperate, will you leave her alone? If you cooperate and keep your mouth shut. Rosie Jenkins and her sister can go on living their small, insignificant lives in peace. Damien Shadow said, opening the door. But if you try to cross us again, he didn't finish the sentence, but the threat was clear. After they left, Alexander Thorne sank into his chair. He looked out the window at Chicago, the city he'd called home for most of his adult life. Now it felt cold and unfamiliar. His phone rang. It was Rosie Jenkins. Alexander Thorne. I'm arriving at the building. Is everything ready for the meeting? Alexander Thorne closed his eyes. If he told Rosie Jenkins the truth, he'd be putting her and Eliza Tate in danger. But if he lied... Alexander Thorne, are you there? I'm here, he said, his voice rough. Rosie Jenkins, about the meeting. Yes. Alexander Thorne looked at the folder with the evidence on his desk. Then he looked at the forged documents Vanessa Dagger had left. 2 versions of the truth. One that could save his company, the other that could protect the woman he was beginning to love. I need to cancel it. Cancel why? Legal complications. We need more time. There was silence on the other end. Alexander Thorne. Are you okay? You sound strange. I'm fine. He lied, hating himself for it. Just a change of plans. All right. Talk later. Of course. Alexander Thorne ended the call and buried his face in his hands. For the first time in his adult life, he felt completely defeated. Damien Shadow and Vanessa Dagger had won, and he didn't know how to fight people who were willing to threaten the innocent. Outside, Rosie Jenkins stood on the sidewalk in front of the Miller Technologies building, looking up with a strange feeling that something was very wrong. Inside the office, Alexander Thorne stared at the contract from Sterling Corporation. In a few hours, he would sign away everything but at least Rosie Jenkins, and Eliza Tate would be safe. Or at least that's what he hoped. Rosie Jenkins knew something wasn't right. The sudden cancellation, the strange tone in Alexander Thorne's voice, the way he avoided eye contact when they finally saw each other in the lobby. After 15 years working with people, she had learned how to read signs. That night, Rosie Jenkins decided to investigate on her own. As a former cleaning staff member, she knew every entrance and exit of the Miller Technologies building. At 9:00 p.m., with only the night security staff on duty, she used her knowledge of access codes, which were rarely changed, to enter through the basement. She took the service stairs to the executive floor. Her goal was simple: to find out why Alexander Thorne had changed his mind so suddenly. In Damien Shadow's office, she found what she was looking for. Unlocked drawers, papers scattered across the desk, signs of someone in a hurry. Rosie Jenkins took pictures of everything with her phone. Fake contracts with Alexander Thorne, whose signature, fabricated emails, manipulated bank records. But what made her blood run cold were printed photos of her and Eliza Tate leaving the hospital with handwritten notes in the margins. Secondary target and pressure point. Rosie Jenkins understood immediately. Damien Shadow had found out about Alexander Thorne's investigation and was using her and Eliza Tate as leverage. She quickly searched for recording devices. Inside a pen holder on Damien Shadow's desk, she found a small digital recorder probably used to capture incriminating conversations. Rosie Jenkins checked the audio files. There were dozens of recordings, including conversations between Damien Shadow and Vanessa Dagger, planning the betrayal. But the most recent one from earlier that afternoon made her heart race. It was the recording of Damien Shadow threatening Alexander Thorne, using her and Eliza Tate as blackmail. Rosie Jenkins copied all the files to her phone and left the building just as quietly as she had entered. At 6:00 in the morning on Tuesday, Rosie Jenkins rang the doorbell at Alexander Thorne's apartment in Lincoln Park. He answered in a bathrobe, looking like he hadn't slept. "Rosie Jenkins, what are you doing here so early? I need to talk to you. It's urgent." Alexander Thorne let her in, clearly nervous. "Rosie Jenkins, about yesterday. There are complications you don't understand. I understand perfectly." Rosie Jenkins pulled her phone from her purse. "I know Damien Shadow is blackmailing you because of me." Alexander Thorne stared at her, shocked. "How did you—" "I heard the recording." Rosie Jenkins pressed play, and Damien Shadow's threatening voice echoed through the apartment. When the recording ended, Alexander Thorne sat heavily on the couch. "Rosie Jenkins, you don't understand the danger. He threatened you and Eliza Tate. I can't take that risk." Alexander Thorne Rosie Jenkins sat beside him. Damien Shadow made a fatal mistake. He recorded his own threats. Alexander Thorne lifted his head, a spark of hope in his eyes. What do you mean I have proof of everything? The recordings, the forged documents, the surveillance photos. Rosie Jenkins showed him her phone. We have enough to bring them down completely. But what about the threats if we expose them? They can't hurt us if they're behind bars. Rosie Jenkins took Tom. Alexander Thorne. Trust me, we have to act today before they realize we've uncovered their scheme. Alexander Thorne looked at her for a long moment. The courage in her eyes, the determination in her voice. What do you suggest reschedule the board meeting for today? 2:00. Rosie Jenkins stood and paced the room as she thought. But this time we'll be ready for them. At 2:00 in the afternoon, the Miller Technologies auditorium was full. All board members were present, along with representatives from Sterling Corporation and several company executives. Alexander Thorne stood on stage, visibly nervous. Damien Shadow and Vanessa Dagger were seated in the front row, confident smiles on their faces. Ladies and gentlemen, Alexander Thorne began. I've called this meeting to make some important announcements about the future of Miller Technologies. Damien Shadow gave him an encouraging nod, clearly expecting Alexander Thorne to announce the merger. First, I'd like to introduce our new Vice President of Operations, Rosie Jenkins. A ripple of surprise moved through the auditorium as Rosie Jenkins stepped onto the stage. Many recognized her as the former cleaner who had been fired for spying. Damien Shadow stood up abruptly. Alexander Thorne, this is ridiculous. You can't. Please sit down, Mr. Shadow. Alexander Thorne interrupted firmly. You'll have your chance to speak soon. Rosie Jenkins stepped up to the microphone. Good afternoon. I know many of you remember the unfortunate circumstances of my last appearance in this auditorium. Her voice was steady and clear. Today, I'm here to reveal the truth behind those events. Rosie Jenkins turned on a projector, and the first image appeared on the screen. The forged Sterling Corporation merger contract. This is the version of the merger agreement that was shown to Mr. Thorne. Rosie Jenkins pointed to the numbers on the screen. According to this document, Alexander Thorne would retain 65% control of the company after the merger. She changed to the next slide. And this is the actual version of the contract, the one they intended to use at signing. Here, Alexander Thorne would retain only 15% control. The room erupted in murmurs. Damien Shadow had gone pale. This is outrageous. Vanessa Dagger stood. These images are fake. Are they, Tom? Rosie Jenkins gave her a cold smile. Then maybe you'd rather hear this. She pressed play on the sound system. Damien Shadow's voice echoed clearly throughout the auditorium. Alexander Thorne is completely naive. 15 years of friendship blinded him to any possibility of betrayal. By the time he realizes what's happened, we'll have full control of the assets and be out of the country. The room fell completely silent. All eyes turned to Kulmi, Damien Shadow, who was clearly panicking. That was taken out of context, he stammered. Was it? Rosie Jenkins moved on to the next recording. And this, Vanessa Daggerchaw's voice filled the auditorium. It's not hate, it's ambition. Alexander Thorne was a good boyfriend, but he was always limited, too small for my dreams. With you, I can have everything I ever wanted. Vanessa Daggertite was furious, but tried to stay composed. These recordings are illegal. They were obtained without consent. Actually, Rosie Jenkins turned to her. They were taken from a recording device found in Mr. Shadow's office, a device he used to record his own conversations. Alexander Thorne stepped back up to the microphone. There's more. He nodded to Rosie Jenkins, who projected the bank records onto the screen. $23 million transferred from Miller Technologies accounts to Mr. Shadow's personal accounts. Rosie Jenkins pointed out. Money that was supposed to be used for legitimate merger preparations. Damien Shadow stood up desperate. Alexander Thorne. We've been friends for 15 years. Are you really going to believe this? This brave woman who risked everything to save me from betrayal. Alexander Thorne interrupted. Yes. Damien Shadow. I'm going to believe her because, unlike you, she never lied to me. Mr. Theodore Bancroft. The main representative of Sterling Corporation stood up. Mr. Thorne's Sterling Corporation had no knowledge of these irregularities. We are a legitimate company that was deceived by dishonest representatives. We completely understand. Alexander Thorne nodded. In fact, we'd like to discuss a legitimate merger with you in the future, on honest terms. Damien Shadow looked around the auditorium, seeing only faces full of disapproval and disgust. At last, his mask of being a respectable executive had fully dropped. You know what? He said with a bitter laugh. I don't regret a thing. Alexander Thorne, you are always too weak to do what needed to be done. You deserve to lose everything, and you deserve what's coming to you, said a new voice echoing through the auditorium. Everyone turned to see Samuel Bright from the Chicago police entering with two other officers, Damien Shadow and Vanessa Dagger. You are under arrest for corporate fraud, document forgery, and attempted extortion, as Damien Shadow and Vanessa Dagger were handcuffed. The auditorium broke into applause. Rosie Jenkins smiled at tall Alexander Thorne, who returned the look with deep gratitude. And something more. How did you know to come here? Alexander Thorne asked the detective. Miss Rosie Jenkins contacted us this morning with the evidence, the detective replied with a smile. Cases like this with such clear proof are a prosecutor's dream. As Damien Shadow and Vanessa Dagger were escorted out, Damien Shadow shouted at Alexander Thorne. This isn't over. I have lawyers. I have contacts. You had them, Alexander Thorne replied calmly. Now all you have is a jail cell. When the auditorium finally emptied, Alexander Thorne and Rosie Jenkins were left alone on stage. So, Rosie Jenkins said with a smile, How was my first day as vice president? Unforgettable. Alexander Thorne pulled her into his arms. Rosie Jenkins, you saved me in every possible way. We saved each other, she said gently, touching his face. Together. Alexander Thorne kissed her right there on the stage where just hours earlier his life had nearly been torn apart. Now with Rosie Jenkins in his arms, he felt like he was finally building something real. And now, Rosie Jenkins asked when their kiss ended. Now. Alexander Thorne smiled. We have a company to rebuild and a life to build together. Outside the building, the sound of police sirens faded into the distance, carrying away 15 years of false friendship and 2 years of fake love. But inside the building, something true and beautiful was just beginning. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Rosie Jenkins was finishing her review of the financial reports in her new office, a spacious room on the same executive floor as Alexander Thorne's with a view of Lake Michigan. As vice president of Miller Technologies, she had already implemented changes that were showing impressive results. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she said, without looking up from the documents. "Madam Vice President, do you have a minute for your CEO?" Alexander Thorne's playful voice made her smile. "I always have time for my boss." Rosie Jenkins finally looked up and was surprised. Alexander Thorne was holding a bouquet of red roses. "What's this, an apology?" Alexander Thorne walked over to her desk. "I know you've been working non-stop these past 2 weeks, and I haven't shown enough how much I appreciate everything you've done." Rosie Jenkins stood up, touched by the gesture. Alexander Thorne: "You don't have to, I do." He handed her the flowers. Rosie Jenkins: "You didn't just save my company. You saved my life. You helped me see the man I truly want to be. You were already a good man. You just needed to learn to trust the right instincts." Alexander Thorne smiled and checked the time. "It's 5:30. How about we get out of here? I have a surprise for you." Alexander Thorne drove through the streets of Chicago in silence, a mysterious smile on his face. Rosie Jenkins' chum tried several times to guess where they were going, but he simply said it was a surprise. Finally, they stopped at North Avenue Beach. The October sun was setting over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "What are we doing here?" Rosie Jenkins asked as they walked along the sand. "Do you remember the first time we really talked?" Alexander Thorne stopped and turned to her. "In the break room when you showed me the evidence." "Of course. You said if I was lying, it would be my last day at the company. And you said if you stayed silent and I lost everything, you'd never forgive yourself." Alexander Thorne took her hands. "Rosie Jenkins, that night you showed me what real courage looks like." Rosie Jenkins felt her heart race. There was something different in Susam. Alexander Thorne's voice and intensity she had never heard before. Thorne. "Let me finish," he said, taking a deep breath. "All my life I thought I knew what success meant: money, power, recognition. But when I almost lost everything, I realized none of that matters without the right person by your side." Alexander Thorne let go of her hands, and Rosie Jenkins, surprised, knelt down in the sand in front of her. Rosie Jenkins. His voice was emotional but steady. "You came into my life as a brave cleaning lady and became my savior, my partner, my best friend, and the love of my life." Rosie Jenkins brought her hands to her mouth, tears welling up in her eyes. "You taught me that a person's true worth isn't in the job they hold, but in the character they show." Alexander Thorne pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. "You taught me that sometimes the most important people in our lives are the ones who have the courage to tell us the hard truths." He opened the box, revealing a simple yet elegant ring with a single diamond sparkling in the golden light of the setting sun. Rosie Jenkins. I can't imagine building a future without you. Will you marry me? Tears were now streaming down Rosie Jenkins's face. She looked at the man kneeling in front of her. The same man who once chose a false friendship over defending her, but who had grown and become one truly worthy of her love. Alexander Thorne. Her voice trembled. Yes, of course, yes. Alexander Thorne stood quickly and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. How did you know my size? Rosie Jenkins asked, admiring the ring. I asked Eliza Tate for help. Alexander Thorne smiled. Actually, I asked for her blessing first. I told her you're the most important person in her life, and that I needed to promise to take care of both of you. And what did you promise? That I'd dedicate my life to making you happy? Alexander Thorne said, kissing her gently, and that our family would always come first. Rosie Jenkins kissed him back, feeling like her heart might burst from happiness. In the background, the waves of Lake Michigan rolled gently onto the shore, and the first stars began to appear in the Chicago sky. I love you, Alexander Thorne, she whispered. And I love you, future Mrs. Trevon. Rosie Jenkins Thorne. 3 months later. Autumn in Chicago had painted the trees cars in Millennium Park with golden and red tones. Rosie Jenkins stood in front of the mirror in her new apartment. She and Paul Alexander Thorne had moved in together the month before at adjusting the simple but elegant wedding dress she had chosen. You look absolutely radiant, Eliza Tate said as she entered the room. Her heart surgery had been a complete success, and she looked healthier and more vibrant than ever. Nervous, Rosie Jenkins admitted. It's strange. When Alexander Thorne proposed, I was so sure. But now, on the day now, you're realizing you're marrying the man you love and becoming part of a beautiful family. Eliza Tate said, straightening her sister's veil. Rosie Jenkins, you deserve all this happiness. Laura Foster arrived with Eliza Tate's latest test results. Perfect heart function, excellent outlook. The sisters hugged, crying with relief and joy. An hour later, Rosie Jenkins walked down the glass aisle at the Lincoln Park Conservatory. The tropical greenery created a magical setting, and about 50 guests waited among palm trees and orchids. Alexander Thorne stood at the altar, glowing with happiness. When he saw Rosie Jenkins, his face lit up with that smile that always made her heart race. You look stunning, he whispered when she reached him. And you look perfect, Rosie Jenkins whispered back. Joseph Blaine began the ceremony, speaking about love, courage, and second chances. When it was time for the vows, Alexander Thorne spoke first. Rosie Jenkins, you came into my life whispering a truth I didn't want to hear. You taught me that real strength comes from integrity and that true love is built on trust and mutual respect. I promise to be worthy of your courage every day of our lives. Rosie Jenkins wiped away a tear before speaking. Alexander Thorne, you've shown me that some people really do change, that some men truly keep their promises. I promise to stand by your side as your partner in everything, through joy and hardship. When they exchanged rings and kissed as husband and wife, the conservatory erupted in applause. At the reception, Dawn. Theodore Bancroft gave a toast to the company's success. In the 3 months since, Rosie Jenkins had become vice president. Miller Technologies had grown by 30% and secured major partnerships. So what's next for the future? Asked Margaret Ellis from HR. Rosie Jenkins looked at Alexander Thorne, then at Eliza Tate, who was happily dancing. Well, Rosie Jenkins said with a mysterious smile, there's actually one surprise we haven't shared with anyone yet. Alexander Thorne looked at her curious. Alexander Thorne. I'm pregnant, Rosie Jenkins said, gently touching her stomach. 6 weeks. Silence gave way to an explosion of joy. Alexander Thorne lifted her into his arms and spun her around as everyone clapped and cheered. Later on the rooftop of the hotel, where they would spend their honeymoon, Alexander Thorne and Rosie Jenkins stood holding each other, looking out at the lights of Chicago below, from janitor and CEO to husband and wife expecting a child. Rosie Jenkins said, "What an incredible journey. The best part?" Alexander Thorne said, kissing the top of her head, "is that our story is just beginning." Alexander Thorne, Rosie Jenkins, turned in his arms. "Yes, thank you for becoming the man I always knew you could be. Thank you for never giving up on me." They kissed under the stars of Chicago. What did you think of Rosie Jenkins and Alexander Thorne story? Share your thoughts in the comments. On a scale from 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to keep up with all our stories. And check out more inspiring stories by clicking right here on the end. Kitch ban ne noi dung ve tin yu hegi.